There is a type of person who spends the better part of their life feeling not broken, but wrongly timed. Too still for a culture that rewards speed. Too complex for a world that grades on clarity. Too rooted in meaning to chase milestones that, deep down, never felt like theirs. For decades, the world handed you a verdict: inefficient, hesitant, late. And for decades, a quiet part of you wondered, what if they're right? Carl Jung would have told you that suspicion was the most dangerous lie you ever believed. Because what the world called your delay, Jung called your architecture. Some psyches cannot be rushed into shape without cracking, and the ones that refuse to crack early are the ones that become immovable later. If you are somewhere in your 50s or approaching them, and you feel something shifting that you cannot quite name, if the noise that once chased you has begun to quiet, if you sense, for the first time, that your real work is not behind you but ahead of you, then you are not watching your story end. You are watching it finally begin to make sense. Before we go further, welcome. I want to know where you're joining us from today. Drop your city, your country, wherever you are in the world, right there in the comments. Because the person watching this in Jakarta and the person watching in Sao Paulo and the one watching alone at midnight in Ohio, you are all part of the same rare pattern, and I want to see you. Now, for most of your life, the culture gave you a mirror that was the wrong size. It measured you against timelines built for a different kind of minds that crystallize early, commit fast, and perform certainty on demand. By those standards, you looked like you were losing. But Jung observed something that modern psychology still struggles to say out loud. Some personalities are not designed for early arrival. They are designed for something far more rare and far more powerful. And that process, what Jung called individuation, does not peak at 30. It ignites after 50. Here is why. And here is what it means for everything you thought you'd missed. Let's go back. Not to your failures, you've revisited those enough. Back to something more specific. That feeling in your early years that the world was moving on a frequency you could hear but couldn't quite tune into. You watched your peers make decisions with a speed that genuinely baffled you. Career paths chosen in a semester. Identities assembled like furniture from a catalog. Confidence that looked, from the outside, completely unearned, and yet somehow worked for them. And you stood there, sensing things they didn't seem to sense, seeing 3 moves ahead in conversations they hadn't finished having, feeling the weight of choices they were making lightly. You weren't paralyzed, you were loaded. But the world doesn't have a category for that. The world has a category for fast and a category for slow. And if you weren't fast, the filing happened automatically. So here is the first truth Jung would ask you to sit with. This was not indecision. This was depth processing. Your psyche was running calculations that others weren't equipped to run. You were not behind. You were operating on a longer timeline with higher resolution. The problem wasn't your capacity. The problem was that depth is invisible, and what is invisible is almost always judged as absence. Think about what that actually meant for you in practice. Every room where someone expected a quick answer you couldn't give without meaning it. Every relationship where your complexity was received as coldness. Every moment you watched someone else claim ground you could see, but couldn't claim yourself, because you refused to plant a flag in soil you hadn't tested. That refusal, most people would call it hesitation. Jung would call it integrity of the psyche. Because here is what was actually happening beneath the surface of what looked like stagnation. Your ego was refusing a shortcut. While others were busy constructing identities that functioned, that got the job, impressed the room, fit the role you were, almost against your own will, holding out for something that cohered. Not a mask, not a performance, something that held up when no one was watching. That is not a minor distinction. That is the entire difference between a life built on borrowed definition and a life built on discovered truth. This was not a lack of ambition. This was a refusal to be assembled by someone else's hands. And it cost you. Don't let anyone minimize that, including yourself. It cost you the easy confidence of early commitment. It cost you the social reward that comes from fitting cleanly into a recognized shape. It cost you years of wondering, in your most private moments, whether the depth you felt inside you was real, or whether you had simply invented a story to explain why you couldn't do what everyone else seemed to manage without effort. That exhaustion is real. The weight of being permanently out of step with a culture that grades on speed, that is not self-pity. That is an accurate reading of a genuine burden you were carrying. But here is what that burden was actually doing. Jung believed that the first half of life has one primary psychological task, building an ego strong enough to face the world. And he warned with unusual urgency for a man who rarely sounded urgent, that if that ego forms too quickly, it becomes a prison, rigid, defended, unable to hold anything that contradicts its early conclusions. The person who commits fully at 22 and never looks back isn't free. They are armored, and armor by design keeps things out. You were not building armor. You were building something with load-bearing walls. The friction you felt wasn't the universe telling you that you were wrong. It was the natural resistance that occurs when a complex structure is being assembled in a world designed for prefabricated ones. And here is where it gets uncomfortable, because the validation I just offered you is only half the picture. Because depth processing, left underground long enough, doesn't just slow you down. It begins to move in directions you weren't expecting. While you were busy making sense of the world's surface, something was accumulating in the depths of you, something you were aware of in glimpses, and then quickly set aside. Jung had a name for it. And understanding what it is, what it was doing all those years you thought you were simply surviving, will reframe every decade you thought you wasted. That is where we go next. While the world above ground was busy performing itself, you went deeper. Not by choice initially. It felt more like gravity than decision, a pull toward interiority that you couldn't fully explain and certainly couldn't justify to anyone who asked, because nobody around you seemed to need to go where you were going. They were building up and out, titles, networks, visible markers of a life in motion. You were building down. And down has no Instagram. Down has no LinkedIn milestone. Down produces nothing you can show at a dinner party when someone asks what you've been up to. So from the outside, and sometimes from the inside, it looked like you weren't doing much at all. Here is the second truth Jung's framework insists on naming directly. This was not laziness. This was energy conservation. Your psyche was engaged in work that has no professional category and no social reward. The slow, painstaking process of testing every value you held against actual lived experience, rather than accepting the prepackaged ideologies your environment kept offering you. Think about how many times you were handed a ready-made framework, a religion, a political identity, a career philosophy, a vision of what a successful life looks like and felt, despite every social incentive to simply adopt it, that something in you wouldn't sign. Not because you were contrarian, not because you enjoyed complexity for its own sake, but because you could feel, with an accuracy that was almost inconvenient, when something was borrowed rather than earned. You kept testing, kept watching, kept holding conclusions at arm's length until they proved themselves in the real conditions of your real life. That process is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to communicate to someone who doesn't share it, because the exhaustion isn't physical. It's the fatigue of sustained discernment, of never fully arriving at the certainty that lets you stop paying attention. Others got to stop paying attention. They chose a lane, committed to its logic, and let the momentum carry them. You couldn't do that. Every lane you entered, you kept noticing the cracks in the pavement. And so you moved underground and you stayed there, and the years accumulated. This was not withdrawal from life. This was the slow accumulation of something that cannot be rushed. Jung used a term that is worth sitting with here: psychic economy. The idea that the psyche, like any complex system, has finite energy, and that the way it allocates that energy reveals its actual priorities, regardless of what the conscious mind believes it wants. Your psychic economy, all those years, was running a project you weren't fully conscious of. You were not conserving energy because you were afraid of spending it. You were conserving it because some part of you, deeper than strategy, deeper than ambition, knew that the purposes available to you at 30 were not the purposes you were being built for. The world offered you ladders. You kept sensing that your building hadn't been located yet. And here is what that actually produced, beneath the frustration and the self-doubt, and the social cost of appearing unmotivated to people running on borrowed certainty. You developed something that cannot be downloaded, cannot be performed, and cannot be faked in the presence of anyone who actually possesses it. Pattern recognition at depth. Not the surface-level reading of a room that any socially fluent person can manage. Something slower and more unsettling. The ability to sense what is real beneath what is presented. To feel the structural integrity or the absence of it in an idea, a person, an institution, a moment. That capacity was not given to you. It was forged across decades of refusing to accept the first answer, the easy framework, the comfortable consensus. And most people around you have no idea you carry it, because it doesn't announce itself. It simply sits there, inside you, growing heavier and more precise with every year you added to it. But there is a question that this raises, one that the excavation phase cannot answer by itself. Because energy that is conserved is not the same as energy that is ready. And purpose that is sensed is not the same as purpose that is claimed. At some point, the underground work has to surface. The compression has to find its direction. And for the rare psyche we have been describing, that moment does not arrive gradually. It arrives as a threshold. And crossing it changes everything, including how you understand every year that came before it. Something changed, and you noticed it before you had words for it. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single morning where you woke up transformed. It arrived more like a tide going out slowly, then completely. The frantic internal noise that had accompanied most of your adult life, that constant low-frequency pressure to arrive, to become, to finally close the gap between who you were and who you were supposed to be by now. It began to quiet. And your first instinct, if you're honest, was suspicion. Because you had been conditioned across decades to equate that pressure with aliveness. The anxiety of not yet having arrived was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also proof that you were still trying, still moving, still in the game. So when the pressure softened, the question followed immediately: is this peace or surrender? Is this wisdom, or am I simply giving up? Here is what Jung's framework answers with unusual precision. This is not withdrawal. This is preparation for consolidation. What you are experiencing is not the quieting of ambition. It is the reorientation of it. The energy that spent decades pointing outward toward proof, toward arrival, toward the validation of a world running on the wrong timeline, has finally found its actual address. It is turning inward, and that turn is not a retreat. It is the most aggressive move your psyche has made in 50 years. Think about what actually shifted. It wasn't that things stopped mattering. If anything, you will notice that certain things matter more now, with a clarity and a weight they never carried before. What dissolved was the performance of mattering, the exhausting theater of demonstrating relevance to audiences you never fully respected. The opinions that used to cost you sleep, you notice they have stopped collecting rent. The comparisons that used to arrive uninvited at 2 a.m., you notice they come less frequently, and leave faster when they do. The version of yourself you spent years trying to become acceptable enough to finally be, you notice you have quietly stopped negotiating with it. This is not resignation to being less. This is the refusal to keep being smaller than you are. And that distinction matters enormously, because the culture around midlife will work very hard to misname what you are experiencing. It will call it a crisis. It will call it depression wearing a philosophical costume. It will offer you reinvention as the cure, new goals, new energy, new performance. The self-help industrial complex is particularly aggressive here, because a person who no longer needs external validation is a person who has stopped being a reliable consumer of the products designed to manufacture it. What it will not tell you, because it genuinely does not understand, is that, for the rare psyche that spent decades building underground, the dissolution of outward urgency is not a symptom. It is the signal. Jung called midlife the most psychologically significant passage of a human life, not because it was the most painful, but because it was the most decisive. It was the moment the first half of life's agenda, building an ego strong enough to survive the world, could finally yield to the second half's far more demanding question. What is this self actually for? Most people never reach that question cleanly. They arrive at midlife with an ego so invested in its own architecture that the question feels like a threat. So they defend. They double down. They buy something, achieve something, pursue someone, anything to avoid the silence where the real question lives. You are not doing that. And the ground that your decades of excavation cleared, the foundation that was invisible while you were laying it, is now becoming visible to you for the first time. Not as potential, not as promise, as fact. You are standing on something. You can feel its weight beneath you, and the peculiar calm you have been misreading as passivity is actually the stillness of a person who has finally located where they are standing. But here is where the threshold reveals its true demand. Because consolidation is not the same as comfort, the quiet that arrives at this stage is not an invitation to rest in what you have survived. It is the precondition for something Jung considered the most confronting work a human being can undertake. You have spent 50 years keeping something carefully contained, managed, socially acceptable, safely small. And it has been patient. But patience, at a certain point, becomes its own kind of pressure. What lives in the shadow of even the most self-aware person, and what happens when it finally stops waiting for permission. That is where we go next. There is something you have been managing for a very long time. Not hiding exactly, managing, keeping at a socially acceptable volume, allowing it just enough expression to prevent it from becoming destructive, but never enough to let it fully speak, because you sensed, correctly, that what lived there was not small, and that a world calibrated for smallness would not receive it well. Call it your edge, your authority, the part of you that sees through pretense instantly and has opinions about it that you learned, early and repeatedly, to swallow. The part that knew, in rooms full of people performing confidence, exactly who actually had the weight and who was simply making noise, and said nothing, because saying it would have cost you something: relationships, likability, the careful social positioning that kept the peace. You became, in many ways, extraordinarily skilled at containment. And the world rewarded you for it, called you measured, called you diplomatic, called you mature, which is sometimes just the polite word for someone who has learned to keep their most formidable qualities out of sight. Jung had a name for what you were containing. He called it the shadow, not because it was evil, but because it was unlit. The reservoir of everything your psyche developed that didn't fit the identity you needed to maintain. Strength that felt too aggressive, directness that felt too brutal, authority that felt too presumptuous to claim. You didn't destroy those qualities. You can't destroy what is genuinely yours. You simply built a room for them, soundproofed, locked from the outside and visited rarely, and always left before staying too long. But here, at this stage, something has shifted in your relationship to that room. The lock feels different, not broken, unnecessary. This is not you becoming dangerous. This is you becoming whole. Because the shadow, Jung insisted, does not contain your worst self. It contains the self you were told was too much. And too much is not a psychological diagnosis. It is a social preference expressed as a verdict. The world around you needed you smaller. You complied. And something real was lost in that compliance, not permanently, but expensively. What integration actually looks like, from the inside, is quieter than people expect. You don't suddenly become confrontational. You don't start saying every true thing that crosses your mind with theatrical abandon. What happens is more precise than that, and in many ways more unsettling to those around you. You simply stop editing yourself for comfort that isn't yours to provide. The meeting where you once softened a hard truth to protect someone's fragile certainty, you notice you no longer feel the old compulsion to do that. Not because you've become cruel, because you have finally recognized that protecting people from accurate information is not kindness. It is a quiet form of condescension. The conversation where you once deferred to someone louder, you notice you no longer experience their volume as authority. You can feel the difference now between weight and noise, and you have stopped pretending you can't. This is not cynicism. This is pattern recognition that has finally been given permission to speak. And here is what this produces in practice, something you may have already started to notice. Your presence begins to function differently in rooms. Not because you are performing authority, precisely because you have stopped performing anything. When a person is no longer managing the gap between who they are and who they are pretending to be, that absence of internal contradiction becomes palpable. People feel it without being able to name it. They orient toward you differently. They choose their words more carefully. They bring you their real questions instead of their rehearsed ones. You are not doing anything to create this. You are simply no longer doing the things that were preventing it. The aggression you feared in yourself, the part you kept locked, was never the problem. Aggression in its integrated form is simply directed energy. It is the capacity to apply sustained pressure toward what matters, without flinching, without requiring approval, without needing the room to be comfortable with your conviction. You no longer explode. You apply pressure, steadily, precisely, with the calm of someone who is no longer afraid of what they carry. But integration, fully realized, does not stop at the edge of the self. Because a person who has stopped negotiating their own worth doesn't just change how they feel inside a room. They change what the room becomes. And that, the final and most complete expression of everything you have been building, is where this has been going all along. You have arrived somewhere that has no name in the language the culture gave you. It is not retirement. It is not contentment in the soft, resigned sense of that word. It is not the absence of desire or the end of hunger. It is something the English language, built largely around acquisition and becoming, was never quite designed to describe. It is the experience of being placed. Not placed by someone else, not assigned a role, not finally accepted by the right institution or the right audience. Placed by the accumulated weight of everything you have processed, survived, refused, excavated, and integrated across 5 decades of a life that looked, from the outside, like it was taking too long to arrive. You have arrived, not at a destination, at yourself, completely, without remainder. And that changes things in ways that are difficult to overstate. This is not detachment. This is integration so complete that performance has become structurally unnecessary. Think about what you are no longer spending energy on. You are no longer constructing arguments for your own worth inside your own mind. That internal tribunal, the one that convened regularly throughout your 30s and 40s to weigh your value against the evidence of your progress, has quietly disbanded, not because you suppressed it, because the case it was arguing has been settled at a level deeper than conscious decision. You know what you are, not arrogantly, not defensively, simply, accurately, with the same neutral certainty that you know your own name. And a person who is no longer negotiating their worth with the world is a fundamentally different presence in it. Watch what happens in the rooms you enter now. You are not louder than you were. If anything, you may speak less, but the quality of attention that orients toward you when you do speak, that has changed. People bring you different things than they used to. Less performance, less competition, less of the social maneuvering that constitutes most human interaction. They bring you their actual questions, their real confusions, the problems they haven't been able to articulate to anyone who needed them to be okay. They do this because they can feel, without analyzing it, that you are not invested in a particular outcome for them. You are not managing them. You are not needing something from them. You are simply present, fully, without agenda. That quality is rarer than intelligence, rarer than talent, and it cannot be manufactured by someone who is still internally divided. This is not wisdom performing itself. This is alignment expressing itself, and the difference is everything. Jung believed that the fully individuated person, the one who has done the complete work of integrating both the light and the shadow, both the persona and the self, becomes something he described with unusual precision, a stabilizing force, not a leader in the conventional sense, not someone who commands through position or volume or charisma. Someone whose mere consistency reorganizes the chaos around them. Because chaos at its root is the absence of coherence, and a person who carries genuine internal coherence, who is not splitting their energy between who they are and who they are pretending to be, introduces coherence into any system they inhabit, not through effort, through presence. Your silence now carries information. The pause before you speak. People have learned to pay attention to it because they have learned, perhaps without realizing it, that what follows has been through something, has been tested, has survived contact with reality. You are not performing authority. You have simply become someone for whom the performance was always the wrong container. And here is the final truth this stage insists on. The years you spent underground, the decades of depth processing, of energy conservation, of excavation that produced nothing visible, they were not the prologue to your real life. They were your real life, every one of them, doing exactly what they needed to do. The foundation was never wasted, the compression was never failure, the delay was never a deficit. It was the only process capable of producing what you are now. But there is one thing this consolidation requires of you. One thing that distinguishes the person who reaches this stage and inhabits it fully from the one who reaches it and retreats into comfortable invisibility. It requires that you use it. Because an immovable foundation that holds nothing is just weight. And everything you have spent 50 years becoming. The world is waiting for what you build on top of it. The question that remains, and it is the most important question this entire journey has been moving toward, is what exactly that looks like for you specifically. And that is where we go next.